The tempest raged outside La Majestic, one of New York's most prestigious hotels. Rain lashed against the windows, creating a haunting symphony that echoed through the opulent lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors, their light reflecting off the polished surfaces like liquid gold. Through the revolving doors stumbled Scarlett Johansson, her hoodie drenched and sneakers squeaking on the immaculate floor. She pushed back her hood, revealing a face devoid of makeup but radiant with natural beauty. Her eyes, usually sparkling with confidence, now held a hint of weariness. At the reception desk stood Heather, a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a crisp uniform. Her posture exuded an air of superiority, her eyes scanning Scarlett with barely concealed disdain. The contrast between the two women was stark, one disheveled but carrying an innate grace, the other polished but emanating an aura of judgment. As Scarlett approached the desk, the air crackled with tension. Heather's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change lives forever. Little did either woman know that this stormy night would unleash a torrent of emotions and lessons that would ripple far beyond the walls of La Majestic. Heather's voice dripped with false sweetness as she addressed Scarlett. "I'm sorry, but I don't see any VIP reservations under your name." Her eyes flickered over Scarlett's casual attire, a subtle sneer playing at the corners of her mouth. "Are you sure you have the right hotel?" Scarlett's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and frustration crossing her features. She reached into her pocket, producing her phone with the confirmation email. "I have the reservation right here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Could you please check again?" Heather's sigh was theatrical, her fingers tapping listlessly at the keyboard. "I'm afraid there's nothing here," she said, not even bothering to hide her disinterest. "Perhaps there's been a mistake. I could recommend a more suitable establishment nearby." The lobby fell silent, save for the muffled sound of rain outside. Other guests turned to watch the unfolding scene, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Scarlett stood her ground, her posture straight, despite the weight of judgment pressing down on her. Scarlett's voice remained level, though a hint of steel had crept into her tone. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please." Her request hung in the air, a challenge to Heather's authority. The receptionist's smirk widened, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "I'm afraid the manager isn't available right now," Heather replied, her tone suggesting she was enjoying this far too much. "But I assure you, I'm more than capable of handling this situation. Now, about that other hotel." Scarlett's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let it show. Years in the spotlight had taught her to maintain composure under pressure. "I'll wait," she said simply, stepping back from the desk with quiet dignity. Heather's facade cracked for a moment, surprise flickering across her face. She hadn't expected this level of persistence. The lobby buzzed with whispers, the tension palpable as guests watched the standoff between the two women. As minutes ticked by, the lobby became a theater of hushed conversations and sidelong glances. Guests huddled in small groups, their whispers carrying fragments of speculation. "Who does she think she is? Doesn't she know this is La Majestic?" The words floated on the air, sharp and cutting. Scarlett stood alone, her back straight and her gaze fixed on the ornate clock above the reception desk. She could feel the weight of stares upon her, hear the murmurs of judgment. It was a familiar sensation, one she had faced countless times before. Heather reveled in her perceived victory, her smug smile growing with each passing moment. She basked in the approval of the other guests, feeling vindicated in her treatment of this apparent interloper. The power dynamic seemed set in stone, immovable and absolute. But fate has a way of upending even the most seemingly unshakable situations. As the hands of the clock inched forward, none in the lobby could have predicted the seismic shift that was about to occur. The revolving door spun once more, admitting a gust of wind and rain, and a figure that would change everything. Robert Downey Jr. strode into the lobby, his presence electric. Dressed in an impeccable black suit, he exuded an aura of effortless charm and undeniable star power. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. Robert's eyes scanned the room, landing on Scarlett with a mix of warmth and amusement. He moved towards her with purpose, ignoring the gasps and wide-eyed stares of the other guests. "Did I take too long?" he asked, his voice carrying just the right hint of self-deprecation. Scarlett's lips curved into a small smile, relief and affection evident in her eyes. "You know how much I love a good patience test," she replied, her voice tinged with dry humor. The lobby erupted into a flurry of whispers and realization. Heather stood frozen behind the reception desk, her face draining of color as the magnitude of her mistake became horrifyingly clear. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, leaving her teetering on the edge of a precipice of her own making. Robert turned his gaze to Heather, his eyes sharp and penetrating. "I believe my friend has a reservation here," he said, his tone deceptively casual but laced with unmistakable authority. Heather's fingers trembled as she typed frantically, her earlier confidence evaporating like mist in the morning sun. "Ah, here it is," she stammered, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Just a system error. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, Ms. Johansson." The words rang hollow in the suddenly silent lobby, each syllable dripping with insincerity. Scarlett raised an eyebrow, her voice cool and collected. "Oh, a system error? How convenient?" The sarcasm was subtle but biting, a verbal jab that left Heather reeling. Robert let out a short, humorless chuckle, his eyes never leaving the receptionist's face. The other guests watched in stunned silence. The earlier whispers of judgment now turned to murmurs of shock and embarrassment. The air in the lobby felt charged, as if a storm had moved from outside to within these gilded walls. The hotel manager burst onto the scene, his face ashen as he took in the tableau before him. He moved swiftly to Scarlett and Robert, apologies tumbling from his lips in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Please, allow me to personally escort you to our finest suite. Complimentary, of course." But Scarlett's gaze remained fixed on Heather, her eyes holding a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "This happens all the time," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support and understanding. The manager's pleas grew more frantic, offering every luxury the hotel could provide. But his words seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier, unable to penetrate the bubble of tension that surrounded the group. Heather stood motionless, her earlier smugness replaced by a look of dawning horror. Robert leaned in slightly, his voice low, but carrying clearly in the hushed lobby. "Tell me something. Would this system error have happened if I hadn't walked in?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but understood by all present. Heather's silence was damning, her eyes darting around the lobby as if seeking an escape. But there was nowhere to hide from the truth that now lay exposed for all to see. If Scarlett had been alone, she would have been turned away, dismissed as unworthy of La Majestic's prestigious halls. Scarlett sighed, shaking her head slightly. "I think this time we won't be staying any longer." Her words carried a weight far beyond their simple meaning, a rejection not just of the hotel, but of the judgment and prejudice it represented in that moment. The manager's face fell, understanding the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before him. This wasn't just about losing celebrity guests. It was about the hotel's reputation, about the values it claimed to uphold. He turned to Heather, his expression a mix of anger and disappointment. As Scarlett and Robert made their way to the exit, the lobby remained frozen in a tableau of shock and realization. Heather stood behind the desk, the weight of her actions pressing down upon her like a physical force. In that moment, she understood that she had made a mistake that would haunt her for years to come. The sleek black car pulled away from La Majestic, its tires splashing through puddles that reflected the hotel's glowing facade. Inside, Scarlett leaned back against the leather seat, her eyes distant as she watched raindrops race down the window. Robert sat beside her, his presence a comforting anchor in the aftermath of the confrontation. "Do you think she learned anything?" Scarlett asked softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice carried a hint of weariness, but also a thread of hope. Robert considered the question, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his knee. "She had a choice," he replied after a moment. "Learn from it or drown in her pride. It's up to her." His words were tinged with the wisdom of someone who had seen both sides of fame and fortune, who understood the complexities of human nature. Scarlett chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to lighten the atmosphere in the car. "Do you always have this Zen perspective?" she asked, a hint of playfulness creeping into her tone. Robert's lips curved into a wry smile, his eyes twinkling with mischief and depth. Back at La Majestic, Heather stood rooted to the spot, her mind replaying the events of the evening in an endless, torturous loop. The manager's words of reprimand washed over her, barely registering as she grappled with the enormity of her actions. She had judged based on appearance, had wielded her temporary power with cruelty, and now faced the consequences. Guests continued to whisper and stare, their earlier admiration for her strength now turned to scorn and disappointment. Heather felt naked under their gaze, stripped of the armor of superiority she had worn so proudly. For the first time, she truly saw herself through their eyes, and the image was far from flattering. As the night wore on, the story of what had transpired began to spread beyond the walls of La Majestic. Social media buzzed with accounts from witnesses, each retelling painting Heather in an increasingly unflattering light. She watched helplessly as her actions were dissected and condemned by strangers across the globe. In the quiet moments between dealing with other guests, Heather found herself questioning everything she had believed about herself. Had she always been this person? Or had the trappings of her job at an exclusive hotel twisted her perceptions? The answers were uncomfortable, forcing her to confront truths she had long ignored. Heather's shift ended as dawn broke over New York, the storm finally subsiding to leave a world washed clean. She stepped out of La Majestic, no longer feeling like she belonged in its grand halls. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional early-morning commuter rushing past. As she walked, Heather's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Shame warred with defensiveness, regret battled against the urge to justify her actions. But with each step, a new feeling began to emerge, a desire to be better, to learn from this humbling experience. She found herself in a small park, the benches still wet from the night's rain. Sitting down, Heather pulled out her phone and, with trembling fingers, began to type. It wasn't an excuse or a denial. It was an apology, raw and honest, posted for the world to see. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass, Heather made a silent promise to herself. She would use this experience not as a source of bitterness, but as a catalyst for change. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of authentic purpose. Miles away, in a cozy apartment overlooking Central Park, Scarlett scrolled through her phone. A small smile played on her lips as she read Heather's public apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a sign that perhaps something good could come from last night's unpleasantness. Robert's voice drifted from the kitchen, where he was making coffee. "Anything interesting?" he called out, the aroma of freshly ground beans filling the air. Scarlett looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe," she replied. "I think our friend from the hotel might be having a change of heart." They sat together on the balcony, watching the city come to life below them. The conversation drifted from the events of the previous night to broader topics: the nature of fame, the power of first impressions, the capacity for human growth and change. As they talked, neither Scarlett nor Robert could have known the full extent of the impact their actions would have. In standing up to prejudice with dignity and grace, they had set in motion a chain of events that would ripple out far beyond one hotel lobby. Weeks passed, and life at La Majestic continued. But something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Heather, once the epitome of polished superiority, now approached her job with a new humility. She greeted each guest with genuine warmth, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. Her colleagues noticed the change, at first wary but gradually accepting. Heather's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder to look beyond surface impressions. The hotel itself implemented new training programs, emphasizing empathy and respect for all guests. One quiet evening, as Heather was nearing the end of her shift, a young woman in travel-worn clothes approached the desk. In the past, Heather might have dismissed her without a second thought, but now she smiled warmly, ready to assist however she could. As she helped the traveler secure a room, Heather felt a sense of peace settle over her. She realized that true strength lay not in wielding power over others, but in using one's position to lift people up. It was a lesson hard learned, but one she would carry with her always. Months later, Scarlett found herself once again standing before the doors of La Majestic. This time, there was no storm raging outside, no need for a quiet retreat. She was here for a charity event, dressed to the nines and ready to face the cameras. As she entered the lobby, her eyes immediately went to the reception desk. Heather stood there, her posture as straight as ever, but her expression softer, more open. Their gazes met, a moment of recognition passing between them. Heather's smile was genuine, tinged with a hint of nervousness. Scarlett approached the desk, Robert at her side. "Welcome to La Majestic, Miss Johansson, Mr. Downey," Heather said, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling beneath the surface. "Your suite is ready whenever you are." There was no mention of the past, no need for further apologies. The change was evident in every word, every gesture. As they moved towards the elevators, Scarlett glanced back at Heather. In that moment, she saw not an antagonist, but a fellow human being who had faced her flaws and chosen to grow. And in that growth, perhaps there was hope for us all.